stragglers. We're going to officially spool up here. This, if you're here, you know what this is. If you're here, you know who this is. This is Peter Beagle. My name's Pat Rothfuss, and technically this is an interview, although more realistically, this is just going to kind of be a chat. We're going to probably very quickly devolve into like dueling story maundering. And
there's one reason we get on is the way we do.
So I'm gonna maybe do a few, and they're streaming this, so
I gather.
I'm gonna try to stay into the mic, even though I can usually fill a room with my voice without it. I'm trying to dial back my voice actually into the mic. Let's do a few of the things that kind of everyone tends to be interested in. Just to kind of, then we can move on to whatever, like some other people ask some questions, or if there's other maybe less furrowed fields that we can wander into. The Last Unicorn.
That one.
Yeah, that one.
Right.
It is a beautiful book. It is my favorite book ever. And this is by way of introduction. I will say the first time one of my very first cons at a World Con, I went to see a panel. I have no idea what the panel was about. I only went because Peter was on it. And I think, actually, I wasn't even published yet. I was at a World Con, and I went. I was excited because my book was in the mill, and it was eventually going to be published. And I went to hear him talk because I love this book so much. And you mentioned The Last Unicorn, and you said, of all the books I've written, it's the hardest to write because I was writing a fairy tale that was also a parody of a fairy tale. And I was just dumbfounded because I had never thought of the book that way. And I realized I had never thought of my own book that way. But I realized then that's what I had been doing with heroic fantasy. And you gave me a great clue into my own writing in that moment. I was absolutely stunned. So that was my first personal experience of Peter Beagle. But do you want to talk a little bit about like how that book came to be? Again, just to kind of talk about it, and then we can move on to other things if you like.
I should mention that only one person has ever connected, or ever understood the connections between The Last Unicorn and a book written in 1945 by James Thurber, of all people, called The White Deer. Nobody, the only person who has ever mentioned that in conversation, or in any way that I know of, was the guy who writes musicals, scores for musicals like Wicked and so on, Stephen Schwartz. Stephen Schwartz made the connection, and as a result, I have a copy of The White Deer autographed by Stephen Schwartz, and he has a copy of The White Deer autographed by me. He's the only one, although it seems obvious to me. But I have written very recently a new foreword, not for The Last Unicorn, but for my first attempt at The Last Unicorn. It's another matter altogether. You might not recognize it, except for bits and pieces. But I was 23 years old, sharing a cabin in the Berkshires, Cheshire, Massachusetts, with my best friend, who was always the painter from the time we were 5. I was a storyteller. He was the painter, and that was the way it was. And this was going to be a really professional summer. He'd be painting, I'd be working on a new book, except that he could go out into the woods and scout landscapes and actually come back with paint on the canvas and sketches in the sketchbook. And I was sitting there in the cabin by myself, trying this possible story. No, that's not going to work. That one, good idea, but nothing else. And finally, I literally came up with one stupid line. The unicorn lived in a lilac wood, and she lived all alone. Terrific. Right. What's a lilac wood? Mm. So I wrote another line. The main thing was to have something on paper by the time Phil came home with his damn canvases. Because we were going to spend the evening playing our guitars. That's what we did. And somehow that summer, I started The Last Unicorn, but it was that early version, which doesn't have either Schmendrick or Molly. It does have a two-headed demon named Azazel and Webster. That's the other head. That's who the unicorn encounters. Azazel and Webster talk an awful lot to each other, the way Phil and I have always talked to each other and still do. I'm 79. Phil will be 79. I always have to remind him. He lives in New York State, and his son told me after we met, I've been staying at the house for a while, we love our dad, but we always thought he was a little bit crazy. Now you're here, and suddenly we realize Dad isn't crazy at all. He's just been carrying on this conversation with somebody who wasn't here. And really, that is the way we talk. Even now, we still fall into it. It's a mixture of old vaudeville sketches, Hope and Crosby, just a lot of pogo. A whole lot of pogo. That really was there's a common line in pogo. I was beginning to like having you for an enemy, but now I remember why I hated having you for a friend. That was the basic of our conversation. That's the way we still talk.
I've read that because it came out a long time ago. There was a very limited run through Subterranean Press,
yes, right.
And it was billed as The Lost Unicorn, which is the first draft of that book. Which again, if you're a fan of the book, like I could not read that. And just to say, it was so interesting to see how different it was with that character. But also, and this speaking as a professional and as a craftsman, as someone who revises and revises and revises and fine-tunes the language, I'm going to be honest, I was a little irritated at how much of it was exactly the same. If this is the first draft you wrote and the language is so clean and beautiful, and I'm like, it was a little disheartening. A little disheartening to see.
This from you?
Yes, from me. It's but now if I remember the story right, and please correct me, you took a run at this, at the story, and then you got to a point and you were like, ugh. And you couldn't quite figure out where to go.
Exactly.
And then what happened?
What happened is that took pretty much all that summer. What happened was that I went back to California, where I had been before, married a woman with 3 children, and suddenly had to put bread on the table. And I'd never had to feed people before. And I only had one talent to feed them with. I never thought I had more than that. I can tell stories, I can use language, and that's it. So I have to use all of it. I did magazine writing. I did interviews. I did everything, literally, from doing a story on cockfighting, which is illegal in California, happened to be on a ranch near Healdsburg in Northern California. I covered that. It was the last regular issue of the Saturday Evening Post. I have a way of closing magazines. But they ran it, photographs and all. I did that, and this is the 50th anniversary. I'm getting a lot of this. The 50th anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King's last campaign.
All right.
I was there. That was the same year The Last Unicorn came out. And when it came out, I was living in a plywood shack on the mall in Washington, D.C., with a wonderful man who I'm sure is gone now, Mr. Collins Harris from Grady, Alabama, Crenshaw County. And I've never written, well, I've written a couple of pieces about that time and what it was like and the people I met there. But that was the kind of work I did because it was all I had. And I've met people who've had much more interesting lives than mine, by my standards, who've been everywhere and covered everything. I remember I worked with a photographer in the 60s named Mike Bry, and Mike and I literally drove around California looking for stories to pick up. And I heard that, I beat Mike to that, I heard that there's this grape strike going on in Delano. I know where Delano is, Central Valley. We could check that out. Somebody named Cesar Chavez. And we got there, and I was told that a freelance writer, a magazine writer named Arnold Heno had already been there. And my reaction as a professional was, oh shit. Whatever story there is, Arnold got it. The kicker, however, we did meet Cesar Chavez, and bless her, his right-hand person, Dolores Huerta. There's a film about Dolores now. And that was worth it just by itself. That and the fact that I got involved in a march from Delano to Sacramento, by farm workers. And I found myself getting sucked into it. And what I remember more than anything is that we passed a lot of shacks that were just thrown together by the owners of the fields for workers who had to find work there. And there was a man who came out of his house with a bucket of water and began going up and down the line, giving water to the marchers. Nobody told him to do that. Clearly, it was his own idea. And every now and then, I've met people who had ideas like that. If it weren't for that, I would have a very dark view of human beings. But every now and then, I have something to go to sleep with, like that. So that was how I was living. And The Last Unicorn, no matter what anybody tells you, was not a bestseller or anything like it. The main thing is that somehow it stayed in print. And finally, that's it. You can't be immortal if you're not in print. Which is why we have 37 plays of Shakespeare and only about 5 of Christopher Marlowe.
Right. Right. Do you remember, because originally there was the demon, the unicorn leaves the wood,
Mm-hmm.
meets the demon, and the demon has just stolen hellfire.
He's stolen a coal
from hell.
Because
he's on the lam. Because
he is on the lam, because hell is going over to modern times. Hell, we didn't have laptops at the time. Well, I would put that in. Because that's what's happening. And Azazel, the larger, more impressive demon, is a traditionalist. That's not the way hell is supposed to be. He and Webster have stolen the single coal from hell to go start up their own somewhere else, according to the proper lines. Webster himself is an anarchist. Which, again, was the basis of my relationship with Phil in many ways. So, yeah, I do remember that. But I was, as always, and as still true today, I was making it up as I went along. Sometimes I get away with it, sometimes I don't. And I do not recommend this to anybody. And I've spoken to writing classes many a time. at least draw an outline. I've only done that twice in my life. Both times I'm very grateful I did. But mainly I'm still making it up.
Yeah, I think it works differently in different people's heads. I've tried the outline myself, but I immediately deviate. I immediately go somewhere else.
Of course.
How about so you cut, you know, like in some ways, like the more vocal character. Why did you make that call? I mean, if you can remember, like, because you had to pick there. It's like, is this the unicorn story or is this the demon story?
It's like that. That was exactly it. And it's the same way in my first novel, A Fine and Private Place.
It was your first one. I had a discussion with somebody else about this. Yeah.
Much of which I wrote during my senior year at college at Pitt. And there's a raven in it who's a scene stealer. People remember the raven when they've forgotten other things about the book. And I had to cut the raven. I had to literally prune him back. He's still in the book. But if I wasn't careful, he was going to steal the book from the major characters, and that's something I've always had to watch out for. The side characters are always the more interesting. That's the problem.
I hear that. And for those of you that haven't, A Fine and Private Place, not only, again, beautiful book and beautifully written, but I would argue, like, perhaps you could make a good case for it being the first urban fantasy book ever written. If not the first paranormal romance book ever written. And if you haven't tried it, you really owe it to yourself.
I would argue, in fact, that the first paranormal urban fantasies really were written by, in a different sort of way, by the guy Last Unicorn is dedicated to, Robert Nathan. A Fine and Private Place was written only because 6 years before I was born, Robert wrote a book called One More Spring, which takes place largely in Central Park. I wanted to write One More Spring, and Robert already had. It's common the same way I've been told by Gary Kurtz, who produced Star Wars. We really wanted to make Flash Gordon, but we couldn't get the rights. That does happen. And with me, it was Robert never saw the relationship. We were friends for the last 20 years of his life. Robert never saw the relationship at all. He said something to me that I could never, to this day, probably have the generosity to say to another writer. He said once, leaving me absolutely whopper-jawed, I think your work gets stronger and stronger as it moves further and further away from mine. I am not sure I could ever have said that to anybody.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick peek here at, and we'll do maybe a little bit of hand-raising Q&A in a bit.
I should mention, by the way, that I jumped at this opportunity because this seems to be the only way Pat and I ever get to hang out. I take it where I can get it.
We met. I ended up at a book festival down in Decatur, and I'd only been published 2 years, maybe a year and a half, and then suddenly it's like, how about you be on a panel with Peter S. Beagle, this little dewy-eyed author, me, and Peter Beagle, and it was all I could do to contain myself. So here's one. You've been working in the industry for a long time. What has surprised or amazed you, you know, as things have like changed over the years?
I can remember it must have been the 1980s, when suddenly everything that came out, every fantasy that came out, had the same couple on the cover, usually her 3/4 naked, and him in a fur jacket with a sword. And the covers were all by Frank Frazetta, or somebody being Frank Frazetta. And there were writers I'd never heard of. And but I remember two things. One, I remember my best friend whispering over my shoulder in one particular bookstore, Forbidden Planet in New York, Peter, who are these people? I couldn't have told him. We grew up on Poul Anderson and Heinlein and Sturgeon, the rest of the old gang. I didn't know who these guys were. But the other thing was, my editor at Ballantine was Judy Lynn Del Rey, whom I loved. And Judy Lynn once sent me a manuscript about so high called The Sword of Shannara. And by, I called her saying, Judy Lynn, this is not only a point-for-point Tolkien ripoff, this is an 8th-rate Tolkien ripoff. And Judy Lynn said firmly, Judy Lynn knew great literature, and she knew crap, and she would market both without shame. She said, never mind, I know exactly what I'm doing. This is for people, and I'm quoting her, this is for people who have read The Lord of the Rings 40 times and can't quite get it up for the 41st. As I say, I love Judy Lynn. And she was absolutely right. She knew exactly what she was doing. She always did.
I love that story. I'm going to tell that 100 times.
Feel free. It's definitely public domain. But I love to remember also is, at that time, I was traveling and living with a black poet named Colleen McElroy, who was the best poet I ever knew. She's retired now, but she taught at the University of Washington. And she was with me in New York when Judy Lynn and she and I and Lester Del Rey, Judy Lynn's husband, were going to lunch. And there was Judy Lynn and Colleen walking ahead of me, Colleen looking very sleek, and Judy Lynn, who was a dwarf, looking like Judy Lynn. And I can remember hearing Judy Lynn saying earnestly to Colleen, you know what I really hate? I hate when people try to lift me over the curb. I remember that.
Wow. So you've mentioned a few. I've actually written down the title of One More Spring because I've never done that. And also, you said you feel like the Last Unicorn owes a lot to, what was the other book?
To The White Deer.
The White Deer.
By James Thurber, published 1945. It's very funny and somehow poignant, and it is exactly a classic fairy tale playing games with the form. So that there is a king, for instance, but the king is unmistakably Thurber's editor at the New Yorker. King Claude, C-L-O-D-E, has only two real interests in life, drinking wine and hunting. But at one point, the royal astronomer, new one, is young, has already learned the safest thing is to see everything through pink glasses. It calms the king. But he rushes in to tell the king and everybody else, a great pink comet just missed the Earth. And it's gone. I remember I stole the line. You know, it's disappeared with I think it was a sish sound, sort of like a cigarette dropped into a cup of water. And Claude says, as Harold Thurber's editor would have said, they aim these things at me. Everything is aimed at me. Claude is really, there is a handsome prince. There are 3 princes in there. And there are a lot of creatures you recognize from fairy tales in there, including a witch. But King Claude is the real hero of the book.
Wow. Are there any other books that you read early on, or that you read as you've like sort of lived in this world, that you feel like it's a shame more people don't know about, or that you feel never really got the recognition they deserved?
I can name one that changed my life when I was 9 years old, that's been in print since it came out in 1908. This is The Wind in the Willows. I had a wonderful teacher for the second and third grade, Maggie Butterwick, who loved Irish literature, looked kind of like Eleanor Roosevelt, and who told my parents not to worry about my grades or my lack of sociability, or the fact that I sat in the back of her classroom writing poems about Tarzan and the Lone Ranger. And when I was homesick with something respiratory, I was always having respiratory problems in those days, she sent me this book, The Wind in the Willows. I came out of bed, so to speak, and back to class wanting to write like that.
Oh.
And it's still, if I have to pick one major influence, even beyond Robert, that was it. I can't even describe it, but the effect. But I still know chunks of that book by heart. That was the one. And then there's one that I read again when I was very young, called The Colt from Moon Mountain, by Dorothy Lathrop, who is well known as a children's book writer. And that has to do with a little girl growing up on a farm in what feels like 19th century Kansas, somewhere in the Midwest, who begins seeing in the woods a wild colt that's not like any colt she ever saw. She doesn't know why, but it's different. She never gets really close to it, though she tries. And she draws her mother into the mystery. And her mother finally looks it up in the dictionary, one of the few books they have in the house, and recognizes one with that funny bump on its forehead. And she realizes that her daughter is seeing a wild unicorn. And I remember one clear thing. There's the farm dog, Brownie, who gets so close to it that it butts him. It butts him into I think the horse trough. And and that's when the mother and the little girl realize what that is. She never gets close enough to it. She almost doesn't want to, and disappears wherever it's going at the end of the story. That's The Colt from Moon Mountain, and I've always remembered it.
Those are going to be good for my little boy, and me. I mean, I'll read them too.
Fair enough.
But I'm always looking for new stuff. And this is just for me. This is a question just for me. Have you ever read the Little House on the Prairie books?
Do you know, I never did. My children did. I know of them. I even have read reviews of the biography of the author that's just out.
You're right, that new one.
Yeah.
I will say, and you made me think of it as like on this farm,
Yeah.
this sort of time period. I never knew they were books. And then I had kids, and Sarah are like, oh, the kid should read. She was reading them aloud to our little boy. They're amazing. They are more fantastic and gripping than 80% of the fantasy I've ever read. Just like, we went out to get water from the creek and there was a panther. And I'm like, oh, like, and it's like, then Ma went out to milk the cow at night, and to feed the cow, and it's like, and there was a bear. And I'm like, oh my God, there's a bear. It's like, this is so scary. Or like there's they're in this series, and there's one called The Long Winter. Have you read this? It is. I read it in the middle of a Wisconsin winter. And I'm reading it to my little boy in the middle of the night, and he's like dropping off, and I'm like, we'll just do one more chapter.
fallen into the habit of spending Christmas in Marshall, Wisconsin. There's this dog who always sleeps with me. It's necessary to get through the winter.
There's and it again, it's such a great window into a different world.
Yeah.
Where like I grew up with a dog. We lived out in the country, and they have their dog. This dog is part of the family in these books. And at one point they pull up stakes and they're going somewhere else, and they find people in a wagon because they have their wagon and they're going somewhere else. They find people in a wagon, but they're just sitting there because they have no horses. And it's like, what's going on? And they're like, yeah, we went to sleep with horses and we woke up with no horses. And Pa Ingalls is like, well, where's your dog? And they're like, we don't have a dog. And he's like, well, do you want to ride into town? They're like, no, we're going to figure this out. And then they drive off, and Pa, who is generally a good-hearted person, at least portrayed this way in the books, had some real things to say about these people. It's like, what sort of people don't have a dog? What sort of people are so dumb? Because like now it's like, oh, it's fun, and this my little fluffy yip dog, it makes me happy, and I cuddle it. But it's like, this was a vital piece of your farming. This kept people from sneaking up on you and stealing your horses in the middle of the night. And it's like, honestly, these books have done more to like really clue me into the mindset of a pre-industrial life than like 1,000 fantasy novels. There's all these lost treasures that I'm finding now that I have children.
I grew up in the city in New York, but I spent a lot of my adult life in the country, one way or another. And so I can literally say my children grew up playing with the children across the stream, like that. But my one As Told To book was, if you like, the fulfillment of a personal fantasy for me, because I got to be friends for over 30 years with a woman named Pat Derby, Patricia Shelley Derby, and it's that Shelley, it's that gang. She wasn't particularly concerned about being a descendant of Percy Shelley, but she was very proud of being descended from Mary Shelley. And Pat was Dr. Doolittle. Pat, I thought about this when Ringling Brothers went under. Oh my God, I wish Pat was still alive. She was the #1 thorn on Ringling Brothers' side, particularly because of the way they treated elephants. And Pat loved elephants more than any other animal. She had every other animal. The last I saw of Pat, who died of throat cancer some years back, somebody had given her, after all these years, 2,600 acres to live on with the animals she was taking care of and rescuing. And the last I saw of her and said goodbye was this little red-haired person, totally surrounded by elephants, all of them reaching down to touch her with their trunks. She was a troublemaker. She did. You remember the cougar on the sign years ago? Mm-mm. The Lincoln Mercury cougar on the sign?
Oh, okay.
That was Chauncey. We dedicated our book to Chauncey because, A, he was a marvelous, dignified animal, and B, he was dying, and we both knew it. And when he did die, Pat lost her voice. I was doing my one As Told To book with Pat, and when Chauncey died, she couldn't talk. And the only way I could get her voice back was to promise her that when we finish this thing, we'll dedicate it to Chauncey. And that did it.
Wow.
Her voice did come back. There's a wonderful frontispiece photo of Pat head-to-head with Chauncey. Mm. The book is called, and this is the publisher's choice, The Lady and Her Tiger. Of course, there's a wonderful cover showing Pat with Rijo. Rijo was the tiger in your tank. He was 11 feet 4 inches long, He weighed 700 pounds, and he thought Pat was Mom. And what Pat wanted to call the book, and I wanted to call it, was Elephants Cost a Lot. And it should have been, because God knows, the nearest she had to a child was an elephant named Nina. And I looked for excuses to take my family and go visit Pat in Southern California. And finally, because the only way I knew to make money, to feed the animals, literally, to buy chicken necks for everything, thank God eats chicken necks, was to talk a publisher at Dutton into commissioning a book. And so I had every excuse to go down and visit Pat. And while I was doing that, I had certain chores. One of them was taking the old wolf, Sylvester, for a walk. Sylvester was he was 14 years old already, and Pat would take him to schools to dispel the legend of the big bad wolf. Adults made Sylvester nervous. He didn't like all wolves. He didn't like anything that towered over him. But he could deal with children, and he would sit there very patiently while children fell all over him. Oh. But one of my jobs was to take Sylvester for a walk. And 14 years old or no, Sylvester still went everywhere at 90 miles an hour. So I didn't so much walk him. I just hung on. Fortunately, like most animals, like me, he's a creature of habit. So I knew the route. But this particular afternoon, he decided for some reason to veer off in another direction. And we came up in somebody's backyard. And there were large dog dishes back there, and Sylvester discovered kibble. He'd never had kibble in his life. Pat fed him as well as she could with what he would have eaten in the wild. Kibble, some bitch. He sniffed it, he nibbled some of it, and he lay down and rolled in it. Oh. And around that point, I looked up and saw the two very large dogs whose kibble it was. Wolves aren't that big. Really, they're not. Sylvester wasn't. Both dogs were bigger than Sylvester, and they didn't move. Whatever that was in their kibble, there wasn't anybody they knew. And I can still see them looking back and forth at each other. And because I tend to make up dialogue, I used to imagine, what the hell is that in our kibble? I don't know, but whatever it is, it's nobody we ever smelled, and I think you should go and talk to him. Why is it always me? You go this time, I'll be right behind you. And they didn't move. And Sylvester finally got bored with kibble, and stood up and shook himself, and we went on our walk. But that was the thing that happened to me when I was with Pat. Again, there was the only piece I've ever written for Harper's magazine. Only time I ever got in my Harper's was when they would do the special on animals, human relationships with animals. And I got to write about taking Spot, the very old leopard, for a walk. Except you didn't do that with Spot. His sleeping cage was always open. He went for a walk when he felt like it. And I just sort of went along with him. Pat lived in Galt, California, on the edge of a valley. And across the valley, there were cows. And what Spot liked to do was to sit on his haunches and just look at the cows. And you could see it going through his mind. Oh, them days. Them days. And by, when he got ready, he'd walk back and hop into his cage. But there was one thing extra about Spot that I knew, that not everybody knew. Spot liked women. Spot liked women a whole lot. Many animals prefer women to men. My half-coyote dog did. But when our book came out, Pat went on tour with it. And they loved her in the Johnny Carson show. And this particular case, I'm home in the living room watching the Johnny Carson show, which I never watched unless Pat was on it. And she had brought Spot. And Johnny Carson also had the actress Adrienne Barbeau, who was at her peak then. She was young and beautiful, And Spot was giving her clearly his unmistakable "come with me to the Casbah." If you knew Spot, there was no question. And I just kept watching. He's not going to. Well, Pat's there. Well, at that point, they went to commercial. And when Pat came back on, Spot wasn't. And I couldn't wait for her to get home. Did he do that thing he do? And Pat laughed and said he was going to. But then he got sidetracked. That trumpet player, Doc Severinsen, let off a blast right in his ear. And you know animals, and one of Pat's rules about working with animals was that animals can only think of one thing at a time. If I'm working with a lion, she used to say, and I can see, lions are easy to read, and I could think that he's just thinking about me as lunch. I don't have to come at him with a whip and a chair, or pistol, or anything like that. I just have to get him thinking about something else. And she had been a dancer. At 15, she was with Sadler's Wells Ballet. So she thought, go into a little floppy crossover step or time step, and if he's watching me dance, he cannot be thinking about meals. And so Spot got completely distracted, Pat said, and was eyeing the trumpet player. I'm old. I haven't done this in a long time. Could I possibly eat an entire trumpet player? He's a small trumpet player. Anyway, she said, after that they went to commercial, and I got Spot backstage and handed him over to Ed, her husband. But there was a moment.
Wow. And
I loved writing that book with her. I was sorry when it was done. Sad in many ways. There were things Pat did not want to talk about the way animals were treated, in captivity. And when she was very young, she'd gotten to animal training and almost accidentally. She was a dancer, a show business person. But she was with a particular group that trained animals for movies and television. And somehow she remembered they had 2 gorillas who had never been taken out of their cases. Wow. They were still in there. They used to play the hose on it. And Pat was 21 years old. There was absolutely nothing she could do. But I remember her writing about the moment when a gorilla, who was doing everything she could to take care for, which was next to nothing. She remembered a gorilla reaching out through the slats to touch her hand. She did not want to put that in the book. And I made her do it. And there are a number of other things in that book that Pat did not want to write about, that I coaxed her into one way or another. So she always had very mixed feelings about that book, but she toured it and publicized it and was really quite proud of it.
See, I didn't know about. Could you give me the title of that one more time?
The Lady and Her Tiger.
The Lady, right? Instead of Elephants Cost a Lot,
right? Which is what I wanted. God knows.
That would sell these days.
I'm sure.
Okay, I've got to peek at the time. If somebody came up to you and said, because Find in Private Place is a beautiful book. You have The Last Unicorn, Innkeeper Song. Is Innkeeper Song still out of print?
Still out of print.
Okay,
but that's still my favorite.
It's amazing. I feel bad gushing. Why is it your favorite?
Because, for one thing, I got to live with those characters. It's a book that's told by a lot of different voices. I had written a song years before called the Innkeeper Song, which is just about 3 women who come to his inn one evening. One's black and walks a bit like a sailor, and he has a glimpse of the steel inside that cane that she carries. One is tall and brown and appears to be traveling with a pet fox. And there's the one who's very, very pale, very white, and wears a beautiful diamond ring, emerald ring. And he doesn't know why they were there, who they were. The song says, "They took my own room, they barred the door, they sang songs I never had heard before. My cheese and mutton they did destroy, and they called for wine and the stable boy." And
Right, yeah. You are correct.
and once they quarreled, and twice they cried. Their laughter blazed through the countryside. The ceiling shook, and the plaster flew, and the fox ate my pigeons, all but two. And in the morning, they're gone. He has no idea who they were, why they were there, where they were going. The only thing he's really sure of, he's just going to have to get a new stable boy. It's one of the few cases where I wrote the words and music together. Basically, I was always a lyricist. Once in a while, I'd come up with a melody. But it was years later before I thought there's a book in that. A book told from the point of view of everybody in the song, including the fox. And that's how the Innkeeper song came to me. I was married at the time with an Indian writer named Padma Hijmati, who was the best writer I ever knew. And I badgered her terribly. I would read her chapter, distracting her from her own work frequently. If you didn't see the name on the top of the page, would you know who was speaking? Which is always the most important to me, finally. I joke about hearing voices. I tell audiences, I get to hear voices because I'm officially a writer. I have a license. If I did not have a license to hear voices, they would put me away quietly in a pleasant place, or else they might burn me like Joan of Arc, who I know heard voices. She said so. And it's like that. If I can't hear the voices, I've lost the book. I lost the story, and I have to go back to where I got off the track. And yet somehow, the Innkeeper song, unlike The Last Unicorn, was a joy to write. You know, I couldn't wait to spend more time with Lal or Nyataneri, or Rossith, the stable boy, who's fallen in love with all of them.
And I will say it's a very rare book in that it is multiple point of view and all first person, which if you're any kind of writer, you just don't do, because it's a madhouse and it's impossible to. It's a death trap of confusion for the reader, to be shifting from point of view, unless you've pulled off very distinct character voices. And again, as I read it, I'm like, I know exactly who is talking in every chapter.
Thank you.
It was a marvel. It was a marvel. That's actually how, one of the ways in which I ended up getting in touch with you, because I read it and I'm like, this book I've got to buy a copy for a friend. And then I'm like, it's out of print. And then I'm like my editor would love to bring this back into print. And then I reached out, and that's when I kind of got in touch with you and Connor, which is a whole different story. We won't go into that.
No, we won't.
Yeah, we won't go into that now. But if somebody were to say, like, hey, or like for the people out in TV land that are watching this on the stream and maybe they haven't read any of your stuff, where would you pick for them to start?
I would finally, I think, either start with that one or with one which, for all I know, gets marketed as a young adult book these days. I don't know. Tamsin.
Oh, yeah.
I have a producer friend, very old friend, who will be here tomorrow. Her name's Lauren Sands. And Lauren and I know each other because Lauren had always wanted to make Tamsin as a film. And I know that if everything clears up, the rights finally revert to me, all the lot, the rest. Okay, we make the live action Last Unicorn, right, we'll do that. Then we get to make Tamsin. I know that. But the thing is, finally, that I didn't expect the Innkeeper's song to go any further than the book. I'm not good at making up worlds. Ursula was. I'm not. But I like that world so much that I keep sneaking back to it. And I worry about the characters and about characters I hadn't met yet. And something I am going to read tomorrow, very briefly, one thing I always learned from stage performances is to leave them wanting more. I'm going to read the last two chapters, the last two paragraphs of a story that's actually told as an old woman by Lal Kamsin Kamsalal, who was always meant to be a storyteller, a griot, the one who carries a tribe's memories with her and teaches a young girl like herself to tell them in the proper way. And finally, after a lifetime of being a wanderer, an adventurer, somebody, as she says herself, somebody my mother would not have liked very much, finally she's back doing what she was always supposed to do. And people come a long way to hear her stories. And she's just telling a story, finished telling a story to somebody who's come a long way to hear it. I'm going to read Lal's last two paragraphs, that's all. And if my voice holds out, I'm going to sing from something that nobody else knows. I know this. When I was a freshman in Pittsburgh, back in the day when the networks sometimes did original musicals, and this one was full dressed like a Broadway musical for 90 minutes. It was called The Adventures of Marco Polo, 1956. The music was drawn from Rimsky-Korsakov, one of my favorite composers. The book was by an unknown television writer named Neil Simon. And the lyrics were by somebody some of my audience might know as a writer of young adult novels that are still in print, written in the 50s and 60s. His name is Edward Eager. He was a wonderful lyric writer, and nobody knows that because every musical he was involved with failed. I used to come in from out of town if I knew Eager had a new musical opening in New York. Skipped Thanksgiving. If I wait for Thanksgiving, it'll close. So I'd find a way to get into New York. And he often did them with his old buddy, my Broadway hero, Alfred Drake. And Alfred Drake played in The Adventures of Marco Polo. And there is a song he sings at the very end of the musical. Marco Polo as an old man looking back from Venice at his life. And I think I've always known that song. The only other person who might know it is my younger brother. And I think I'm old enough to sing that one now. So that's what I'll do tomorrow, leave him laughing. Always leave him wanting more.
In the book that came out as Giant Bones, but I think, was it in the UK? It was called The Wizard of
Caracos, The Magician of Caracos.
The Magician of Caracos.
Everywhere else but in the States.
Yeah. Which, when you were talking about going back and revisiting some of these characters in these worlds, I realized something that I sort of knew at some point in my revision and then I forgot, which is in that story, in the story, the Wizard of
The Magician of Caracos.
The Magician of Caracos.
Yeah.
And the magician is just a farmer. He's the most powerful, magician of his day, and he's just a farmer, and he's farming. He's busy. And
brewing beer. He's serious about beer.
Right. This is his passion. It's not the magic, whatever magic. But then something happens, and then he gets angry. And in that story, you say something very close. I'll need to go back and look at it, but it's of all things that you should be afraid of, it's the anger of a gentle man, which kind of made it into one of my books a little bit.
Delighted to hear it.
So I'll cop to that officially. we are coming close to time. So again, a question. This is just for the public good. Have you seen Hamilton yet?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I honestly don't know anything about it except its success.
I went in pretty cold myself. Again, the opposite of New York is small town Wisconsin, where I grew up. So I have not done a bunch of musical theater, but I went in and was just like, stupefied. So like, you want to go let's fix that, because if you enjoy musical theater, you gotta, right? He's gotta go.
I was raised on musical theater. My favorite cousin choreographed Hair.
Right. So like, let's get you in to see that. Have you listened to any of the music?
No.
Oh,
haven't heard that at all.
Okay.
And I'm one of those people who memorize lyrics even if I don't like them. I wake up in the morning usually with some other song running through my head, and the only way to get rid of it quite often is to start a backfire. Think of some other song.
Yes.
That'll do.
There's song killers. Like for me, I hesitate to bring it up because today what I have in my head is In the Heights, which is
Miranda.
It's Lynn's his first one. But the thing that will always burn a song out of my head is Putting on the Ritz.
Yeah, that's proper.
But the cure is worse than the disease often.
Well, you know, as an old man, one thing that's happened, which I'm not crazy about, but it does happen, I cry a lot more easily than I used to. I think it's because my parents were wonderful. They never put any. I knew that as a grown man, if I needed to, I could still put my head in my father's shoulder and cry, and he wouldn't think any the less of me for it. But all the same, American males are taught you suck it up, fight it back. And now, I still do it, but I don't have to anymore. I don't have to fight it back, and it sneaks up on me. So I can remember, of all things, there's a song. There have been 2 movies made out of Charlotte's Web. One of those books I would give anything to have written. But in the animated version made earlier, 1973, there is a title song called Charlotte's Web. And I cannot listen to it without crying. And the only thing to do in that case is go to my all-purpose song to go to is, of all things, the 1968 Tony Award black version of Hello, Dolly, which is not my favorite musical, but all the same, they do, celebrating it, they do a couple of chorus numbers with the whole cast, and then the whole cast files off stage, and there's just, God bless her, Pearl Bailey, whom I grew up with, Pearl Bailey on stage, getting slowly off a luggage cart, sliding into the ultimate Screw You song, which is Wave Your Little Hand and Whisper So Long, Dearie. And I can't look at that without smiling. Oh, that's it. That's where I need to go. And just look at that. And I grew up with Pearl Bailey. I'd forgotten not just how good a singer she was, how graceful she was. Look at that. She's a large woman, and there isn't a move on stage that isn't graceful. Look at her hands. I'd forgotten how beautiful her hands were. And look at the way she strides the stage. Somebody who grew up singing on the street in Philadelphia. Look at that. And I'm okay. Pearl always does it.
That's
I literally say thank you, Pearl, and go back to work.
That is, I would happily do this for hours more. We're at time and a little bit over. I think that's a great note to go out on. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming.
It's been a joy, as it always is.